have asserted that the Doppler shift in radar, if radar is to detect the Doppler shift, that we're dealing in microwave radar with extremely slight Doppler shifts. There isn't much Doppler shift in radar signals, considering the radial velocity of targets and the microwave frequencies we're talking about. Well, you might ask, how much Doppler shift is there? So to put numbers on this, I give you one more thing that all radar engineers know. I've given you a list as we've gone along of things all radar engineers know. And another of that list would be this, the rule of ones. Now, first of all, to determine how much Doppler shift there is, here's some formulas over here that will give the same, roughly the same results as this rule of ones that we're going to discuss. First of all, I do remind you, the Doppler shift we're talking about, of course, comes from the radial component of velocity, the rate of change of range, as I show here. Just reminding you that when you speak of the Doppler shift produced by a target of a certain speed, you have to know in which direction is he flying. If he's flying tangential to the radar, there is no Doppler shift. But if he has a radial component of his velocity vector, that's, of course, what produces Doppler force. So what is this rule of ones? Let's take it this way. If I had a radar that had a carrier frequency, was operating with a carrier frequency of 1 gigahertz, an L-band radar, 1 gigahertz carrier frequency. And if I had a target that had a radial component of velocity of 1,000 feet per second, this is the rule of ones. 1 gigahertz radar, 1,000 feet per second radial velocity. The one-way Doppler, well, we're not interested in one-way Doppler, I know, but this is the rule of ones. The one-way Doppler would be 1 kilocycle. All right, so the two-way Doppler would be 2 kilocycles. Not exact, but close enough for this kind of thinking. So 2 kilocycles produced in a L-band radar of 1 gigahertz carrier frequency with a 1,000 feet per second radial target. 2 kilohertz produced. Well, my radar is not an L-band radar, it's an S-band radar. Fine. 3 gigahertz carrier frequency instead of 1, 6 kilohertz. Well, the target's not flying at 1,000 feet per second, which is just about Mach 1, by the way. 1,000 feet per second radial. He's flying at Mach 3. Fine. 18 kilohertz of Doppler shift. But to get the operative word, the significant word is kilohertz. I'm getting Doppler shift in kilohertz in radar, in microwave radar, for targets of reasonable speed. And I want you to join me in this bit of an illustration of this phenomenon. Let's suggest here that I've drawn 2 sine waves. Yes, these are sine waves. So let's suggest I've drawn 2 sine waves. They're continuous. They go on forever. But one sine wave is at a slightly different frequency over the other, but very slightly. I've suggested this one might actually be a slightly higher frequency of sine wave, but slightly higher, you see. All right, now, with these 2 sine waves drawn, I want you to take a sample with me. Let's just take a sample here. There we are. That's one sample there. And then I'm asking you in this sample, which of these is the higher frequency? And of course, you couldn't tell. You'd say, well, they look like the same frequency to me. And I'd say, that's right, they look like the same frequency to me too. By the way, while we're here, why don't you just make a note of the phase relationship between these 2 sine waves? Well, Mr. Hill, you've drawn them in phase. That's right, I drew these in phase. Fine. Let's just go on down now. Let's go on down. And let's take another brief sample of these sine waves. And I look at this sample taken here, you see? I look at this sample and I say, now which of those is the higher frequency? And you say, I don't know, they look like the same frequency to me. I say, that's right, they look like the same frequency to me too. But make a note of the phase relationship between the 2. And you'd say, well, you've drawn them out of phase. They look 108 degrees out of phase. And then you'd say, oh, I know what you did. On the bottom trace, you've crowded in half a cycle between these 2 samples. Or 3 halves of a cycle. Or 5 halves of a cycle. Or you've taken out half a cycle. or 3/2 or 5. Do you get the idea of ambiguity immediately? You wouldn't really know which of those conditions prevailed. You knew there had been a change of frequency, a frequency change between the two traces, but you wouldn't know which of those prevailed. So you get the idea of ambiguity that's associated with sampling of these, in this case, sine waves. So you see, this is my way of explaining that when I use radar pulses of a microsecond, a millionth of a second, to detect a Doppler shift in my signal, one thing I do not do is send out a radar pulse at one frequency and expect to hear it come back at a shifted frequency. Our samples are far too short. Our samples are 1/1,000,000th of a second duration, and the Doppler shift we've been talking about is in kilocycles. But I can detect that there's been a Doppler shift by comparing the phase of the echoes from pulse to pulse in a series of pulses, in a dwell composed of many such pulses. And we build a radar to do that. When we build a radar to do that, we call it a coherent radar. Here is a diagram of a coherent radar. I want you to start with me at this operation of what we call the coho, the coherent oscillator. And in your own note set there, I'd like you to make, at the IF frequency, at the intermediate frequency, I'd like you to make a little pulse going out this arm of this oscillator that is working at the intermediate frequency. But over on this arm, I want you to make not a short pulse of that intermediate frequency, but a continuous presentation of the intermediate frequency. We're going to use this, you see, as a reference all during the listening period after we transmit this pulse. All during the echo time, we use this as a reference. All right, so our little intermediate frequency pulse goes out, gets up-converted to the RF by the action of a stable local oscillator and a mixer, gets up-converted to the radio frequency, to the transmit frequency, gets amplified by my transmitter, up through the antenna, out it goes. I get signals back, and they possibly contain an echo signal that is Doppler shifted, but the return signals, in any case, I get back, I down convert to the IF through this mixer. We've talked about down conversion from RF to IF before by the same stable local oscillator, and I have the signal represented here. All the echo signal I'm getting represented by at the IF at this point. Now at this point, you'll notice this is a mixer that is comparing or dealing with both inputs at the same frequency, at the IF frequency. We call this a homodyne mixer, a synchronous detector. We call it, in colloquial terms, a phase detector. And it has this output truth to it. I will get a voltage out that is indicative of the phase difference of the two signals in. You see, the only way we can measure that there's been a Doppler shift in my echo signal is to compare the phase of the signals being returned, pulse by pulse, with what had been transmitted each time. And this radar is equipped to do that, producing here what we call coherent video, or bipolar video, or this output of the synchronous detector in any case. So we have this bipolar video, or phase indicating video, coherent video, to deal with. If I had this experience out of my phase detector of such a radar, and these are the returns coming from the phase detector now, showing that there is no change of phase relationship from pulse to pulse. No change of phase relationship between what was transmitted each pulse and what was being received.